Hey guys, tonight we step inside the vast, sun-baked temples of ancient Egypt, where the walls themselves seem to whisper secrets, not of kings or gods this time, but of something much more delicious: recipes. Imagine running your fingers over worn hieroglyphs, etched by long-forgotten hands, chronicling how the ancient Egyptians fed themselves and honored their deities with food. It's a silent story carved in stone, a culinary diary that you probably won't survive reading straight through without nodding off. But before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where and when you're joining the sleep train. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge slowly along the cool, shadowy halls of a temple, the walls towering high, their surfaces etched with rows of tiny symbols. At first glance, these might look like endless columns of ancient scribbles, but hidden in these cryptic carvings are detailed instructions on how to prepare meals that sustained a civilization along the Nile for thousands of years. The thought itself is oddly comforting. Somewhere beneath all that history and grandeur, people just wanted to eat well. And not just any food. These weren't random scraps, but carefully crafted recipes recorded with reverence, as if cooking was a sacred art, inseparable from religions and everyday survival. The Egyptians didn't use paper for these recipes. No scribbled notes or cookbooks passed down from mother to daughter. Instead, temple walls doubled as the recipe book. You imagine scribes with their reed brushes, painstakingly painting or carving these instructions, preserving them for priests, cooks, or maybe even future generations of hungry travelers like yourself. This might sound dry, but here's a quirky twist. Some of these recipes weren't just for eating. They had magical or ritual significance. The idea that what you put on your plate could also be a prayer, an offering, or a charm to keep evil spirits at bay still puzzles historians today. Did they cook for the gods or just for the living? Historians still argue whether these culinary inscriptions were primarily practical or symbolic, blurring the line between a menu and a mystical text. You trace a particularly well-preserved panel showing grains, fish, and pots bubbling over fire, each glyph a step in the process. It's almost like watching a cooking show, but without the fast cuts or catchy music. You start to wonder, what did this ancient kitchen smell like? Probably a mix of smoky wood, dried fish, and sweet spices, blending into an aroma that filled temple courtyards during festivals and everyday meals alike. Temples weren't just places of worship. They were community hubs where food connected people to their gods and to each other. And here's a mental image for you. Imagine that every recipe on these walls was a link in a vast chain of cultural memory, handed down not through Instagram posts or food blogs, but through chisels and paintbrushes. Each dish was a thread woven into the rich tapestry of Egyptian life. You might think of temple walls as cold and uninviting, but tonight you feel the warmth of those ancient kitchens breathing through the stone. You're standing at the crossroads of history and hunger, a place where the mundane act of cooking is elevated to an act of devotion. It's comforting, in a way, knowing that even thousands of years ago, people were trying to figure out how to turn simple ingredients into something nourishing, flavorful, and meaningful. And as you settle deeper into this ancient world, keep that thought with you. The recipes on these temple walls are not just instructions. They're a bridge between worlds, between the living and the divine, between past and present. Grains were king. Barley and emmer wheat, the ancestors of our modern wheat, were grown in abundance, harvested during the annual flooding cycles of the Nile. You can almost hear the rhythmic pounding of grain into flour by hand, a ritual as repetitive as the rivers rise and fall. This flour became the base of most meals, primarily bread, but not just any bread, flatbreads, loaves with dense crumb, sometimes flavored with spices or sweetened with dates. Interestingly, historians still argue whether these breads were always leavened or mostly unleavened. You step away from those towering temple walls and imagine the daily staples that kept ancient Egyptians fed and functioning in the hot, dusty environment along the Nile. Grains, beans, and fish weren't just incidental fare. They formed the backbone of this civilization's diet. Picture yourself in a bustling market near the river. Baskets heavy with chickpeas, lentils, and barley. The air thick with the smell of drying fish and freshly baked bread. These simple ingredients grounded daily life, fueling everything from the pharaoh's court to the laborers building colossal monuments. Now, beans and legumes might not sound exciting, but they were crucial protein sources for the common folk. Fava beans and chickpeas popped up regularly on ancient menus, yet their exact role is debated. Some scholars argue legumes were staple proteins, while others suggest they were more supplemental, perhaps even avoided by wealthier classes. Either way, these humble pulses made their mark. And here's a quirky tidbit. Fava beans were considered so important they sometimes ended up as offerings to gods or embalming ingredients for the dead, a curious blend of cuisine and spirituality. Fish, too, flowed in from the Nile like a natural supermarket. Catfish, tilapia, and perch provided necessary fats and proteins. But, unlike today's fish markets, fishing wasn't always about quantity. It was often seasonal and bound by religious taboos. Certain species were sacred or taboo, which makes you wonder if the Nile was more like a fishy VIP club than just a food source. Temple inscriptions show fishing scenes, sometimes with nets and harpoons, sometimes with traps made of reeds. Ingenious, if a bit low-tech by modern standards. Oddly, the exact extent of fish consumption is still debated. Some scholars believe fish was a luxury in some regions and a daily staple in others, while others think it had symbolic or ritual significance beyond mere nourishment. Imagine an ancient Egyptian peasant's meal. A dense slice of bread soaked in broth made from boiled beans or fish stock, sprinkled with herbs and onions. Not fancy, but hearty. The constant presence of grains, legumes, and fish reflects an economy deeply connected to the land and river cycles, where seasons dictated what was eaten and when. You probably won't be surprised to learn that these dietary staples influenced social hierarchies too. The elite could afford fresh meat or imported delicacies, but commoners relied on the trio of grains, beans, and fish, cooked simply but with care. That mix was nutritious and sustainable, reflecting a deep understanding of what the Nile's ecosystem offered. You might even think of it as an ancient balanced diet, long before modern nutritionists came along. In some, grains, beans, and fish formed the invisible threads, stitching together Egyptian society's daily rhythms, temple rituals, and even funerary practices. As you imagine all this, the grains and fish on temple walls stop feeling like static carvings and instead become living evidence of a people intimately tied to their environment. And hungry as you might be right now, you find yourself at the heart of ancient Egyptian daily life, where bread and beer come together like an inseparable duo, almost like the peanut butter and jelly of their era, but with a bit more grain and a lot more bubbling fermentation. The smell of freshly baked bread mingles with the yeasty, slightly sour scent of beer brewing nearby, creating an atmosphere that's both comforting and slightly intoxicating. Literally, bread wasn't just food. It was a symbol of life itself. You watch as bakers prepare dough from the ever-present emmer wheat or barley flour, mixing it with water and sometimes a pinch of salt or date syrup. The oven's heat transforms this humble mixture into loaves and flatbreads, many shaped in decorative forms, sometimes stamped with hieroglyphs or royal seals. Here's a fun detail. Some loaves were shaped like animals, or even the scarab beetle, possibly for good luck or to please the gods. These designs were more than artistic. They gave the bread a kind of personality, a small magic embedded in every bite. Beer, on the other hand, was the ancient Egyptian energy drink. Made by fermenting breadcrumbs with water and a bit of date or honey for sweetness, beer was everywhere, from the workers' lunch break to temple rituals. Imagine giant vats of frothy brew being churned and tasted in bustling breweries. The beer was often thick, cloudy, and slightly sour, not the crisp lager you might expect. And yes, it was mildly alcoholic, but more importantly, it was nutritious and safe to drink when clean water wasn't always available. You might wrinkle your nose at some of the brewing methods. Ancient texts describe fermentation happening in open containers, sometimes with wild yeasts and natural bacteria involved. Modern brewers might gasp, but Egyptians loved it that way. And here's a quirky fact. Some brews were flavored with medicinal herbs or spices like coriander, not just for taste but possibly to aid digestion or ward off illness. Historians still argue whether the beer was primarily a social drink or had ritualistic significance, possibly used as offerings to gods or as part of temple feasts. Bread and beer were paired so often that they became the staple meal for many Egyptians, from high priests to laborers building the pyramids. This combo was cheap, filling, and provided enough calories to keep people working hard under the relentless sun. Workers' graffiti even jokes about beer being more precious than gold on tough days. A sentiment you might find relatable if you've ever needed a pick-me-up after a long shift. In the temple kitchens, bread and beer weren't just sustenance. They were part of sacred offerings. You can almost see priests carefully selecting the best loaves and freshest brews to place on altars, hoping to please the gods or ensure a bountiful harvest. There's something deeply human about this. The belief that food connects us not only to each other, but to something bigger than ourselves. While we're on the topic of bread, remember those symbolic loaves from Section 1. This is where the ritual meets the real. some breads were deliberately made with unusual ingredients or shapes specifically for temple offerings, while others were the everyday fare you'd buy from a street vendor. The lines blur. Were they recipes, prayers, or both? Scholars continue to debate the answer, but one thing is clear. Bread and beer were the ancient Egyptian culinary heart and soul. So next time you reach for a sandwich or a cold drink, think about those ancient bakers and brewers, working in dusty temple courtyards, crafting the staples that fueled an empire. And remember, that slightly sour, thick beer was the original energy drink. Probably not FDA approved by today's standards, but definitely effective. You lean in, catching a whiff of something exotic, cumin, coriander, maybe a hint of dill, and suddenly the world of ancient Egyptian cooking shifts from plain to aromatic. Spices and herbs were the secret whispers in those temple kitchens. The invisible magic dusting the everyday and the sacred alike. They didn't just flavor food, they layered it with meaning, healing power, and even a touch of mystery. Coriander seeds, for example, were everywhere. You can almost hear the gentle crackle as they're toasted in a clay pot, releasing their citrusy, slightly sweet aroma. Egyptians prized coriander not only for cooking, but as a medicine and a protective charm. Some temple recipes recommend it to ease digestion. Others sprinkle it in ritual dishes to invite blessings. Here's a quirky note. Yet coriander was even used in cosmetics, blended into ointments to scent the skin and protect it from sunburn. Maybe that's why they say Cleopatra smelled so good. Her secret wasn't just perfumes, but also spices from the kitchen. Cumin was another staple. You might recognize its earthy, warm scent, but the ancient Egyptian version was often paired with other herbs like fennel and dill. Imagine those flavors swirling through soups, stews, and even breads. You might be surprised to hear that some spices were so valuable they traveled great distances, sparking early trade networks. The presence of these aromatic ingredients shows a refined palate, a love for complexity that goes beyond mere survival. But here's where things get really interesting. Historians still argue whether these spices were primarily culinary or magical. Were they sprinkled on food for flavor? Or were they symbolic offerings designed to ward off evil spirits? Some temple recipes mix spices with animal fats and resins in ways that suggest ritual use rather than everyday cooking. The lines blur, and the debate continues. You also catch a faint, earthy aroma of herbs, like rue and thyme. Rue, bitter and pungent, was often used medicinally and in purification rituals, while thyme might have been added for its antiseptic qualities. These weren't just ingredients. They were tools for health and spiritual protection, blurring the boundary between medicine and food. In fact, some herbs mentioned in temple texts are still in use today for natural remedies, showing the longevity of Egyptian botanical knowledge. But deciphering exactly how and when these herbs were used in cooking versus ritual is like trying to read a recipe that's part cookbook, part spellbook. Think about that. You're not just tasting flavors, but touching a system where cooking, medicine, and magic intertwine. Every sprinkle of spice carries multiple meanings. Flavor enhancer, health booster, spiritual shield. This multi-layered use is what makes ancient Egyptian cuisine so fascinating and complex. And yes, the Egyptians loved their pungent spices, but they also had a thing for sweetness. Mixing aromatic herbs with honey or dates wasn't uncommon, creating a balance that must have delighted the senses. You might even say they were the original food alchemists, blending flavors and functions in ways we are still unpacking. So, as you settle in with these ancient scents swirling in your mind, remember, Egyptian spices weren't just about taste. They were part of a larger story, one that challenges modern assumptions about food's role in ancient cultures. The aromatic world of pharaohs is more than seasoning. It's a fragrant mystery that historians are still savoring and debating. You glide deeper into the temple's stone corridors, where food and faith merge into grand feasts fit for gods and mortals alike. Temple feasts weren't your average dinner party. They were elaborate, ritualized meals, serving not only to satisfy hunger, but to connect with the divine. The walls you've been tracing transform into banquet tables, groaning under the weight of breads, meats, fish, fruits, and mysterious dishes whose true purpose still puzzles scholars. Imagine the scent of roasted duck mingling with incense as priests and worshippers gather to honor the gods. These feasts were as much performance as meal, with food offerings carefully arranged on altars and tables. Each dish a symbol layered with meaning. You might think it's just glorified catering, but for the ancient Egyptians, these were sacred acts, part of ceremonies that kept the cosmic order in balance. Historians still argue whether some dishes were meant to be eaten by humans or solely by the gods, leaving room for debate about what ended up on the temple table versus the banquet table. One fascinating dish, often mentioned in temple inscriptions, combines fish, bread, and a sauce made from fermented grains and herbs. A recipe that seems oddly practical, yet ritualistic. Some believe it was an everyday meal elevated to a sacred status, while others see it as a symbolic communion between earthly and divine realms. You can almost hear the murmur of priests reciting prayers over these offerings, each bite a spiritual gesture. The preparation itself was a communal event. Temple kitchens were busy hubs, staffed by skilled cooks who followed strict guidelines to ensure food purity. You can picture them washing grains, cleaning fish, and roasting meats over open fires, all under the watchful eyes of temple overseers. Food safety was surprisingly important, with evidence suggesting certain foods were avoided or prepared differently to maintain ritual cleanliness. Lavish spreads at festivals celebrated the gods' favor and reinforced social hierarchies. Nobles and priests dined on cuts of meat and exotic fruits, while commoners might receive portions of bread and beer. The act of sharing food was a reminder of divine generosity and human gratitude, a cycle that kept temple economies thriving. It's almost like an ancient all-you-can-eat buffet, but with far more symbolism on the menu. You might chuckle at the idea that some of these ritual meals included ingredients that modern palates might find odd, like salted fish mixed with honey or bread flavored with frankincense. These combinations hint at flavors and meanings lost to time, but also reveal the Egyptians' experimental approach to cuisine. Maybe they were the original foodies, mixing the sacred and the savory in equal measure. This blend of practical nourishment and ritual purpose makes temple feasts a unique window into how food shaped not only bodies, but beliefs. As you imagine the flickering torchlight casting shadows on banquet tables heavy with offerings, you realize these meals were living rituals, part prayer, part celebration, part communal bonding. So, as you rest here in the temple's twilight, remember that ancient Egyptian food was never just about taste. It was a language, a symbol, and a bridge between the human and the divine, preserved in recipes etched on stone, waiting to be tasted again. At least in your mind, you find yourself moving beyond the humble grains and fish, stepping into the world where meat and poultry become luxury items, the culinary jewels of ancient Egyptian feasts. Imagine the sizzle of roasting duck over an open flame, the rich aroma weaving through temple kitchens, promising a rare treat reserved for the elite or special occasions. Meat wasn't just food. It was status, celebration, and sometimes a little bit of showmanship. Interestingly, duck and goose were favorites, not just for their taste, but for their fat, which was used in cooking and sometimes in cosmetics or lamps. The ancient Egyptians had preservation tricks that might seem a bit strange today. Salting, drying, and smoking meats to keep them edible in the blistering desert heat. Some texts describe using natron salt, a mineral mixture also used in mummification, to cure meats. It's like a two-in-one solution. Preserve your steak and prepare it for the afterlife. Beef was especially prized, but raising cattle required space and resources, so it was far from everyday fare for most Egyptians. You can almost picture the herds grazing along the fertile banks of the Nile, their role not just as food but as symbols of wealth and power. The slaughtering and distribution of meat were tightly controlled, often linked to religious festivals or royal banquets. Meat cuts found in temple inscriptions are detailed, showing an impressive knowledge of butchery that would make modern chefs nod in approval. Historians still argue about how often meat was actually eaten by the average person. Some suggest it was mostly reserved for temple rituals and feasts, while others believe that certain meats were part of everyday diet in rural areas. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, but the idea that meat was a rare treat fits the archaeological evidence. You might find it amusing that some preservation methods included packing meat in honey or wine, substances you'd expect in desserts or drinks, but the Egyptians were not shy about multitasking ingredients. This overlap of flavors and functions is a recurring theme. It seems they loved experimenting, blending what we might now separate strictly into savory, sweet, or ritual categories. And poultry wasn't just dinner, it was an experience. The Egyptians raised ducks and geese domestically, but also hunted wild birds like quail and pigeons, sometimes using elaborate traps depicted in temple murals. These birds appear frequently in banquet scenes, suggesting their special status. The fact that goose fat was prized for cooking tells you that flavor was just as important as nutrition. Imagine the careful preparation required. Plucking, cleaning, stuffing with herbs, roasting over embers. these meals were more than nourishment. They were performances of skill and tradition, showing off both culinary artistry and social standing. It's like watching a chef's signature dish from 4,000 years ago, carved not in a menu but in stone. You might recall the bread and beer of earlier sections, and it's interesting how meat was always paired with these staples, turning a simple meal into a feast. Temple recipes sometimes mention bread soaked in meat broth, combining textures and tastes in what we'd now call comfort food. It's a timeless combo. So, as you settle into this savory scene, remember that meat and poultry in ancient Egypt were symbols as much as sustenance. Luxuries that connected people to gods, status, and each other in ways that went beyond the plate. You're now drawn into the aromatic world of ancient Egyptian fruits and vegetables, a quieter but no less vital part of the culinary landscape. Picture yourself strolling through a temple garden, lush with fig trees heavy with ripening fruit, grapevines trailing along trellises, and rows of onions and leeks swaying gently in the Nile breeze. These gardens weren't just for show. They were practical, sacred, and a source of everyday nourishment. Figs were the sweet jewels of the ancient Egyptian table, eaten fresh or dried for storage. You might imagine the sticky sweetness coating your fingers as you bite into one, an ancient natural candy. Grapes were also cultivated, not only to be eaten, but turned into early forms of wine or juice. Although historians still argue about the exact methods Egyptians used for wine production, it's clear that grapes held symbolic as well as culinary value, often appearing in art and religious rituals. Vegetables like onions, garlic, leeks, and lettuce were staples, adding flavor and texture to dishes. Onions in particular had a strong cultural significance, symbolizing eternal life because of their concentric layers, an image carved into tomb walls and used in funerary rituals. You can almost feel the crunch as you bite into a fresh onion, its sharp aroma filling the air. This wasn't just food. It was a symbol layered with meaning, blending sustenance and spirituality. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some ancient Egyptians believed that garlic could boost strength and endurance, which is why it was often given to laborers building the pyramids. Imagine those workers munching on raw cloves to power through their days. A natural energy booster, long before modern sports supplements. It's a reminder that food and function were closely linked in ancient times. And then there's the mysterious role of wild greens and herbs, many of which are still being identified by archaeologists. Some were foraged, others cultivated in small plots near homes and temples. Historians still debate how widespread vegetable consumption was among different social classes. While the elite enjoyed an array of cultivated produce, commoners might have relied more on foraged greens and legumes. The reality was probably a patchwork, reflecting geography, season, and status. Fruits and vegetables were also used in ritual offerings and temple feasts, often displayed in bowls or woven baskets as gifts to the gods. These offerings weren't just about feeding deities. They were symbolic gestures of abundance and gratitude. The presence of these foods in tomb paintings suggests a belief in their importance for sustenance in the afterlife. As you imagine the colors and textures of these fruits and veggies, the deep purple figs, the green onions, the pale lettuce, you realize how they brightened the diet and temple rituals alike. They were the fresh, vibrant counterpoint to the heavier breads, meats, and beers. So, as you rest here in this verdant temple garden, remember, ancient Egyptian fruits and vegetables were more than just food. They were symbols, medicine, labor boosters, and spiritual tokens woven into the daily and divine fabric of life along the Nile. You find yourself now drawn into the fascinating world of ancient Egyptian sweets and desserts. Because yes, the Egyptians had a sweet tooth long before modern bakeries and candy shops. Imagine a temple kitchen filled with the rich aroma of honey, dates, and figs slowly simmering together, the sticky scents wrapping around you like a warm, cozy blanket. Sweet flavors were prized, but not just for pleasure. They carried deep cultural and religious significance, transforming simple ingredients into divine gifts. Honey was the golden jewel of Egyptian sweetening, collected from wild hives and carefully stored in clay jars. It was used to sweeten bread, cakes, and even beer. You might be surprised to learn that honey didn't just flavor food. It was also a medicine and a sacred offering to gods like Hathor, the goddess of love and fertility. Honey was so revered that it sometimes appeared in tomb inscriptions as a metaphor for eternal life's sweetness. Historians still argue whether ancient Egyptians used honey mainly for culinary purposes, or if its symbolic and medicinal roles overshadowed its use as a sweetener. Dates, often dried and preserved, were another cornerstone of Egyptian desserts. Imagine biting into a chewy, caramel-like date, the natural sugars melting in your mouth. Dates were often mixed with nuts or ground into pastes and formed into sweet cakes. Some temple recipes even combined dates with spices like cinnamon, an imported luxury that signaled wealth and trade connections far beyond Egypt's borders. Then there were sweetbreads, sometimes baked with a mix of flour, honey, and dates, often shaped into elaborate forms or stamped with symbols to honor the gods. These weren't just snacks. They were part of religious ceremonies, offerings to ensure favor and fertility. Picture the bakers carefully crafting these sweet loaves, each one a little edible prayer. You might smile at the idea that some desserts included ingredients we wouldn't typically expect, like salted fish or cheese, combined with honey or fruit in surprising ways. This mix of sweet and savory was common, and suggests a different approach to flavor than the strict categories we use today. And speaking of cheese, the Egyptians also made soft, fresh cheeses from cow or goat milk, sometimes mixed with herbs or honey to create sweet or savory dishes. It's a quirky detail that cheese, often considered a modern luxury, was part of their culinary repertoire over 4,000 years ago. Sweets played a role beyond taste. They were part of healing rituals, temple offerings, and even funerary practices. The idea that sweetness symbolized life, rebirth, and the divine is a recurring theme in temple inscriptions and tomb paintings. So as you settle into the gentle sweetness of this ancient kitchen, remember that Egyptian desserts were more than indulgences. They were symbols of abundance, health, and connection to the gods, wrapped in sticky layers of honey and history. You're now drawn into the bustling marketplace scenes of ancient Egypt, where the aroma of freshly baked bread mingles with the sharper scent of dried fish and pungent spices. These markets were lively centers of trade, gossip, and daily life, where temple recipes often found their way into street food and home cooking. Imagine vendors shouting over the crowd, offering their wares, loaves stamped with royal seals, jugs of thick beer, baskets piled high with onions and garlic, and sacks of fragrant herbs. Street food was simple but satisfying, designed to be eaten on the go or shared in small gatherings. You might picture a vendor selling freshly baked flatbreads stuffed with onions and herbs, or offering chunks of dried fish soaked in spicy sauces. These quick bites were the ancient Egyptian equivalent of today's food trucks, fueling workers, travelers, and temple visitors alike. But not everything in the market was straightforward. Some items, like certain spices or dried meats, were luxuries that only the wealthy could afford regularly. This created a food hierarchy reflecting the broader social structure, where temple cooks crafted elaborate dishes, while everyday people made do with staples like bread, beer, and vegetables. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some market vendors doubled as healers or herbalists, selling not just food but remedies made from spices and herbs. You might find coriander mixed with honey to soothe a cough or garlic offered as a natural antibiotic. This blend of commerce and medicine shows how closely food and health were linked in Egyptian culture. Historians still argue about how much influence temple recipes had on popular cooking. Were temple dishes replicated in homes, or did common folk develop their own culinary traditions? The evidence suggests a fascinating exchange, where sacred and secular food cultures mingled and evolved. Imagine the sensory overload of these markets. The bright colors of woven baskets, the chatter of haggling customers, the mix of sweet, sour, and savory smells swirling together. It's a vivid snapshot of daily life that brings the temple recipes off the stone walls and into the hands of everyday Egyptians. As you drift through these ancient streets, you realize that food was a social glue, a way to connect people across class and function. Whether it was a sacred feast or a quick snack from a street vendor, each bite was part of a shared culture steeped in history. So next time you're enjoying street food, remember the vibrant marketplaces of ancient Egypt, places where the sacred recipes from temple walls met the bustling rhythms of everyday life. You slip into the cooler shadow of an ancient Egyptian brewery, where the rich scent of fermenting grains fills the air like a warm, comforting blanket. Beer wasn't just a beverage, it was the lifeblood of daily existence, the staple drink for kings and commoners alike, brewed and enjoyed in both humble homes and grand temples. You can almost hear the steady rhythm of pounding grains, the bubbling of fermentation vats, and the quiet conversations over jugs of frothy, sweet beer. The brewing process was surprisingly sophisticated. Egyptians used emmer wheat or barley, soaked, malted, and baked into bread loaves that were then crumbled and soaked in water to ferment. The resulting beer was thicker and cloudier than modern lagers, more like a nutritious porridge with a low alcohol content. It was nourishing, hydrating, and often safer to drink than Nile water, making it essential for daily survival. Beer played many roles. It was an everyday refreshment, an offering to the gods, and even a form of currency. Workers building the pyramids were famously paid in beer rations. The beverage was so important that the goddess Hathor was sometimes called the mistress of beer, highlighting its divine significance. Historians still argue about the exact recipes and brewing techniques, as different regions and periods experimented with various grains, flavors, and fermentation methods. You might chuckle at the fact that some ancient Egyptians flavored their beer with dates, honey, or herbs, creating unique brews that might surprise modern palates. This wasn't just about flavor. These additives could also influence fermentation, preservation, and even medicinal properties. Interestingly, beer was often paired with bread, the other great staple, creating a complete nutritional package that powered armies, workers, and priests. You can imagine a feast where beer flowed freely. Bread was broken and dipped, and social bonds were strengthened over shared drinks. Some temple texts detail the ritual brewing and offering of beer, where it was poured as libations to gods and ancestors, symbolizing life, fertility, and renewal. This ritual importance elevated beer beyond mere drink, embedding it deeply into spiritual practice. It's worth noting that beer's central role in Egyptian life influenced many other cultures, laying the groundwork for brewing traditions worldwide. Yet some debate remains about how commercialized or domestic brewing truly was. Did most people brew at home, or was it controlled by temples and officials? The answer may vary depending on time and place. So, as you sip this mental draft of ancient beer, remember, it's more than just a drink. It's a story of survival, celebration, and sacred connection, steeped in the sands and waters of the Nile. You drift now into the heart of ancient Egyptian kitchens. Not just the grand temple hearths, but the smoky, sun-dappled spaces behind mud-brick homes and beside bustling courtyards. You hear the crackle of open fires, the bubbling of clay pots over glowing embers, and the soft shuffle of barefoot cooks moving between grinding stones and baking ovens. This is where temple recipes transformed into lived experience, where food became comfort, tradition, and quiet ritual. Home kitchens weren't glamorous, but they were the engine of daily life. Most were outdoors or semi-open, using simple tools, grinding stones for flour, clay ovens shaped like inverted cones for baking, and stone or ceramic vessels for boiling, stewing, and storing. You imagine kneeling beside a broad slab, patiently crushing grains with a rhythmic motion, while the scent of boiling onions drifts lazily through the air. Cooking was often communal. Women, children, and sometimes hired cooks worked together, exchanging gossip and technique, much like you'd find in any lively household today. Recipes weren't written down, but passed by memory and repetition, a living oral tradition. And yet, these domestic meals often mirrored the temple offerings. The same breads, the same lentil stews, the same beer poured from curved jars, just in simpler forms. One quirky tool still puzzles archaeologists. A small, paddle-shaped instrument found in many kitchens. Was it used to flip bread, stir stew, or maybe beat batter? Historians still argue about its function. A charming reminder that even the most basic tools can be mysteries without context. Mealtime was informal, but sacred in its own right. Families sat on the ground or low stools, sharing bowls and loaves, dipping bread into bean purees or meat drippings when available. There were no forks or spoons, just fingers and bread, used to scoop, sop, and savor. It's a tactile, intimate way of eating that it connects you directly to the food. The act of cooking itself often held quiet ritual power. Certain foods were avoided on specific days, or blessed before preparation. The first loaf of the day might be set aside for household gods or ancestors. You can almost see a small household shrine near the hearth, perhaps a tiny statue of Bees, or Taware, watching over the bubbling pot, ensuring health and safety through the act of nourishment. The line between home and temple, between daily cooking and ritual, was soft and often blurred. Some of the dishes prepared at home echoed those made in temple feasts, especially during festivals or funerals, when families replicated offerings to connect their own tables with divine ones. It is tempting to imagine these home cooks as silent and serious, but the truth was probably more vibrant. Jokes, songs, and family stories likely swirled with the steam from lentil stews. The kitchen was alive, a space of tradition, invention, and love. You can almost hear a mother reminding her daughter to use just the right amount of coriander, not too much, or the stew will wake the gods before they're ready. And yes, even the most sacred temple recipes probably had humble cousins simmering in clay pots all over the Nile Valley. A chickpea mash spiced with garlic and cumin here, a honey-sweetened cake there. Echoes of grandeur in simple bites. So, as you sit beside this flickering hearth, watching the smoke spiral into the Egyptian twilight, remember that the real soul of cuisine isn't found in gold-plated dishes or priestly rituals. It's in the humble, loving act of feeding each other. You now find yourself at the twilight edge of the day, where food in ancient Egypt takes on a new, more symbolic role. One that looks not just at the body, but at the soul. Here, in the hush of temple tombs and afterlife inscriptions, you uncover how recipes weren't just for feeding the living. They were prepared to nourish the dead. Yes, that lentil stew might have doubled as a snack for a ghost. Spooky? A little, but also deeply human. Imagine a tomb chamber lit by flickering oil lamps, the air thick with the scent of myrrh and roasted offerings. You see a low stone table carefully laid with bread, beer, onions, and meat cuts, perfectly arranged like a silent banquet. These were funerary meals, eternal provisions meant to accompany the soul, or Ka, into the next world. Egyptians believed the afterlife was a continuation of earthly life, just with better lighting and fewer taxes. So, naturally, you'd need your favorite foods, right? The temple recipes recorded on walls weren't just for feast days. They were often included in tombs so that the soul could enjoy them forever. Sometimes the inscriptions listed ingredients and methods in almost cookbook-like detail. Not just for decorative purposes, but for magical activation. The belief was that by naming a dish, you brought it into being for the deceased. You might chuckle, but this was serious culinary sorcery. Honey cakes shaped like lotus flowers, roasted goose rubbed with herbs, bread loaves embedded with dates and nuts. These weren't just fancy meals. They were metaphysical guarantees. The idea was that as long as the tomb remained intact, the food would be eternally available. Historians still argue whether these depictions reflected real recipes or idealized visions, a sort of aspirational menu for the next life. Some tombs even included miniature ceramic dishes and food models, like an ancient version of toy food which were believed to transform into actual sustenance in the afterlife. Picture a soul reaching for a clay pot and, poof, there's a steaming bowl of fish stew inside. Pretty convenient. You have to admire the optimism, and not everything was luxurious. Everyday items like garlic, lentils, and even dried fish appear in these tomb feasts, showing that comfort food mattered just as much as fancy fare. It wasn't all golden goblets and roast oxen. Sometimes you just wanted your mom's barley porridge. Food, after all, was memory. One fringe theory even suggests that certain tombs may have doubled as ghost kitchens, places where priests and family members periodically brought real food to refresh the spirit, kind of like meal delivery for the dead. While some scholars raise eyebrows at this, it is clear that physical offerings were part of ongoing funerary rites. Food was more than tribute. It was a bridge between worlds, and perhaps the most poignant detail. Some recipes included instructions for smell. The scent of incense, roasted meats, or bread baking was thought to awaken the soul, bringing the spirit into the room, in a way that makes these recipes early multi-sensory experiences. Scent, sight, memory, magic, all baked into one. So, as you drift among these eternal kitchens, remember that the recipes etched on temple walls weren't only about cooking. They were acts of love, remembrance, and belief. Proof that even in the afterlife, the best comfort comes from a warm meal. You now wander through the more mysterious corners of the ancient Egyptian culinary record, where ingredients weren't always edible, and recipes were as much about ritual as they were about eating. Here, food becomes incantation, offer-in, and occasionally downright weird. You step softly along corridors lined with carvings of food meant for gods, spells involving onions, and a few ingredients that definitely wouldn't pass modern health inspections. Take, for instance, crocodile fat. Yes, really. Some temple recipes reference its use, not just for anointing, but possibly as a cooking fat or a ritual substance mixed with herbs. Imagine slathering your bread in that. While it might sound a bit stomach-churning, the Egyptians believed ingredients like this held sacred power. Crocodiles were both feared and revered, especially linked to the god Sobek. So, including such animal parts in temple concoctions may have been a form of offering, transformation, or divine intimidation. And then there's the infamous sunscreen made from crocodile dung. No, it's not a culinary ingredient, we hope, but it appears in medical papyri alongside recipes for poultices and beauty creams. While it wouldn't be considered food, its proximity to other herbal and spice combinations used in kitchen and temple practices makes you wonder where exactly they drew the line. Historians still argue whether such applications were truly widespread or symbolic. Maybe a metaphor for protection, not literal sunblock. Some temple recipes also read like spell books. A dish isn't just a dish. It's prepared with steps like recite the names of the gods, face the rising sun, or add coriander and fennel at the hour of Ra. You imagine a priest-chef chanting while stirring a clay pot, blending sacred timing with spice proportions. It's food by the stars. Literally, you also find recipes that clearly weren't meant to be eaten by people. For example, temple texts sometimes describe cakes baked from grain and animal fat, soaked in wine, then buried as part of agricultural rituals to encourage crop fertility. These sacrificial offerings were culinary in form, but magical in function. You might think of them as edible prayers, meant for the earth, not the stomach. One quirky item, a bread of lamentation, used in mourning rituals. This loaf wasn't baked to be tasty, it was meant to absorb grief. Some scholars believe mourners would cry over the bread, symbolically transferring sorrow into it, then bury or discard it to release their sadness. That's comfort food on a whole different level, and just when you think you've seen it all, there's evidence that some temple meals were designed to mimic the texture or color of sacred animals. Black lentils for the fur of a jackal, red spices for the blood of divine foes. It wasn't about deception, but symbolism. The food stood in for something greater, something cosmic. So, while you might not want to recreate these temple dishes in your modern kitchen, unless you've got access to crocodile tail fat and a serious tolerance for funky smells, you can still appreciate their role in a world where food, faith, and the fantastic were inseparable. As you settle into the surreal blend of spice and spell, remember, ancient Egyptian recipes weren't just about what filled the belly. They fed the spirit, invoked gods, and sometimes served up the bizarre with a sacred twist. You move now into the flickering torchlight of the scribe's chamber, where the recipes weren't just cooked, but carved, painted, and inked into eternity. Here is where you find the most sacred of cookbooks, not in parchment pages, but etched into limestone, brushed onto temple walls, and tucked into papyrus scrolls. Recipes as scripture, menus as magic, and not everyone got to read them. Imagine a temple scribe hunched over a slab of fine limestone, carefully chiseling lines about how to prepare a bread offering to Osiris. He's not just writing a recipe, he's preserving divine protocol. You can hear the soft scrape of the chisel, the occasional muttered curse when a glyph goes wrong. These recipes were precise, often poetic, and deeply encoded in the religious and symbolic language of the time. Some wall carvings describe food preparation with extraordinary detail. Quantities, steps, ingredients, even order of operations. One particularly detailed inscription describes the preparation of white bread of the gods, a high-quality loaf made from sifted emmer wheat, mixed with milk and honey, and baked in a dome-shaped oven. But was this a literal recipe or a symbolic act of devotion? Historians still argue whether these carved instructions were meant for earthly cooks or divine understanding. Many of these temple walls also included depictions, images of servants grinding grain, butchers slicing meat, cooks stirring pots. You realize the recipes were performative, almost like a storyboard. Each panel guided ritual and kitchen action, ensuring the cycle of offering and worship never faltered. It's kind of like the world's oldest illustrated cookbook, only instead of being propped up in your kitchen, it's 40 feet tall and guarded by jackal-headed gods. And while you'd expect only the priests and elites to access such sacred knowledge, some scholars believe fragments of these temple recipes were passed down orally to common cooks. Maybe not the full divine loaf recipe, but simplified versions adapted for home altars. Picture a cook muttering a half-remembered incantation while seasoning lentil stew, just enough of the sacred to keep the gods interested. There's also the papyri, the ancient scrolls that held everything from laundry lists to love spells. Among them, you find scattered culinary references. One medical papyrus lists a barley cake baked with garlic and honey, prescribed for digestive troubles. Another details a date and wine syrup, meant to revive the weary of heart. It's hard to tell where medicine ends and dessert begins. You might find it a bit ironic that these stone-carved recipes, meant to preserve knowledge forever, are often fragmentary today. Time, tomb robbers, and erosion have worn away crucial details. We're left with a line about roasting, a list of spices with no quantities, or a drawing of a duck beside a mysteriously unlabeled pot. Scholars piece these clues together like culinary archaeologists, trying to reconstruct meals with only half the ingredients and no oven manual. Here's a quirky twist. Some scribes appear to have made editorial comments in the margins of these temple texts, like a spiritual version of sticky notes. One faint glyph seems to mock a certain cook's skill, an ancient meh review perhaps. Imagine carrying that critique into the afterlife. So, as you linger in this chamber of ancient instruction, where ink and chisel once translated hunger into holiness, remember, these recipes were more than nourishment. They were sacred transmissions, preserved not just for flavor but for faith, identity, and eternity. You reach the final chamber, deep within the quiet heart of a temple, where the lines between food, magic, memory, and myth blur entirely. Here, meals are more than sustenance, more than offering. They are transformation, and every dish recorded on these cool stone walls carries whispers of something larger. Stories of gods who ate, feasted, fasted, and punished through famine. Recipes, in the end, were myths in edible form. You pause beside a worn relief of the goddess Isis stirring a cauldron of herbs and grain. An image repeated across temples from Philae to Karnak. Was it a real recipe? Probably not, but the message is clear. Divine beings, like humans, needed nourishment. Feeding gods wasn't just ritual, it was theological maintenance, keeping the cosmic order intact. You can imagine a priest whispering prayers over an offering dish, convinced it held the key to balancing heaven and earth. In the tale of the distant goddess, for instance, Hathor flees Egypt in a fury, bringing drought and destruction. The only way to lure her back. A trap made of red beer dyed to look like blood. She drinks, grows tipsy, and returns, saving the land. The moral, food, and drink could restore divine favor. Historians still debate whether this myth was ever reenacted with literal dyed beer, but the fact that it's recorded in temple ritual scripts suggests that maybe, at least once, someone did. Even the Nile's annual flooding, the central heartbeat of Egyptian life, was honored with food. Special riverbank meals, often involving fish, barley cakes, and wine, were left out to feed the river, ensuring its return. Again, you wonder, who were these meals really for? The river gods, or the people hoping the gods were listening? One strange and charming ritual involved baking cakes in the shape of enemies and destroying them, eating them sometimes, or throwing them into fire. Symbolic digestion, if you will. This ritual destruction of food echoes older magical practices, where bread was shaped into crocodiles or serpents to consume danger before it reached the real world. An ancient version of "you are what you eat," but with a lot more drama. Even the kitchen gods, minor deities who guarded the flame or ensured the stew didn't burn, had little roles in the pantheon. Offerings were sometimes left for them too. Scraps of bread, bits of meat, a splash of beer at the edge of the hearth. It's a quirky, intimate reminder that even divine beings might get peckish. You also find stories of fasting. Not the religious kind you might expect, but symbolic refusals to eat that marked grief, reverence, or penance. Kings would fast before major rituals. Widows might go without bread for days to honor a deceased husband. The absence of food was as telling as its abundance. Temple texts often recorded these acts as part of larger narrative cycles, where food marked not just physical need, but emotional and spiritual alignment. Perhaps the most touching motif is that of the eternal meal, the belief that in the afterlife, one would sit at a table with their loved ones, enjoying a perfect version of their favorite foods forever. It's depicted again and again. Smiling figures with goblets, slices of melon, fish laid out in perfect rows. The ancient Egyptian idea of paradise wasn't harps and clouds. It was a feast. And as you sit now with all these flavors lingering in your mind, the tang of lentils, the stickiness of honey, the burn of garlic, the cool sweetness of figs, you begin to understand why food played such an oversized role in Egyptian belief. It wasn't just about eating. It was about belonging to a family, to a community, to a cycle of gods, ancestors, and nature itself. So, as you gently step back from the final mural, your journey through the temple kitchens nearly complete, take one last glance at those stone-carved menus. They are the memory of a civilization that cooked not just for hunger, but for legacy. Now Kuma dim the scene. The voices grow soft, the flavors blur into vapor, and the last torch in the corridor flickers out. Let your breath slow now, as the night drapes itself over the desert. The great temples fade behind you, their halls quiet again, empty of steam and laughter. You feel the stone cool beneath your fingertips, the hum of ancient stoves, now just a memory. The Nile sighs in the distance, a gentle reminder that time, like water, always flows forward, softly, steadily. In your mind, you can still taste it all. The honeyed dates on your tongue, the tang of beer warmed in the sun, the smoky scent of roasted goose hanging in the twilight. Each recipe, a small anchor to a world long gone, yet strangely familiar. A world where food was love, power, ritual, and remembrance, folded into the same pot, seasoned with belief. You might still hear echoes from that kitchen, the hush of grinding grain, the low lull of prayers as bread was baked for the gods. The sacred and the mundane simmered side by side. There's peace in that, isn't there? Knowing that even in ancient times, people found comfort in the rhythm of cooking, in the steam rising from a clay bowl, in the breaking of bread with someone they loved. So now, just let it all drift, like incense in the cool night air. No need to remember the names or ingredients, just the warmth, just the hum. You've feasted with pharaohs, baked with temple priests, and stirred pots with ghostly cooks under a ceiling of stars dot. Let your eyes close gently. Let the kitchen grow still. And sleep now, full and safe.